Hi, I'm going to be talking about the KKK in the 1920s. So it started right after the Civil War as a white supremacy group that kind of opposed on everybody else. For example, black people, immigrants, especially in the 1920s, they were really against Catholics, liberals, Jews. They were against everybody that wasn't white. They were worried, especially during this time period, that immigrants were changing the culture of America. So they were even especially against immigrants and specifically Mexicans. So there was a lot of violence that the white supremacists, the KKK, brought. And everybody on the opposing side of the white supremacists were the people that they were against. So, for example, the Jews, the Catholics, liberals, everyone that the KKK didn't necessarily like. So there were two very distinct sides. A lot of organizations started to grow because of the KKK against them, trying to advocate and protest against them because what they're doing or what they were doing is very, very wrong. So there was a lot going on. There was a rapid grow in the KKK during this time period, especially because of the Civil War. So one of the biggest fights or protests that the KKK participated in was on August 8th of 1925 when about 50,000 members of the KKK stormed the Capitol in Washington, D.C. So they stormed the streets of D.C. wearing their white supremacy masks and outfits. Some of the national leaders of the KKK were wearing more colorful outfits and they were on horses. Many members would hold up crosses with a K on it, and there was about 75,000 people watching the entire thing. Everybody knew about it. It was one of the largest statements that the KKK did during the 1920s. Got everybody talking. Everyone was like, there's so many people, so it was very chaotic and powerful, but not necessarily in a good way. And also the KKK was a very violent from the start. They'd always been a violent group. They would always murder innocent people, especially the people that they oppressed against. They would just have violent riots all the time. A big thing that they would do, a large statement that they would do, is they would take crosses and burn them on the lawns of people, just random people. So that in this situation, there were a lot of innocent civilians and people getting hurt and murdered. There were often beatings and whippings. And one thing that I found very interesting was that they would specifically go harass doctors who would perform abortions. So there was a wide variety of people that they would try to hurt and attack and use violence against, and it was a big thing for them during that time, which is horrible and disgusting. So it's also pretty obvious that the opposite side of the KKK won the decade. They started decreasing towards the end of the decade because a lot of different organizations and groups were starting, like I previously talked about, to work against them. So there would be a lot of protests, like how I just talked about the protests that the KKK would do. There would be a lot of protests on the other side, whether it was Jewish people starting organizations or colored people. One of the big ones was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that was a really big one that would constantly protest and try to push away the KKK, and it did end up working. So by the end of the decade, it was extremely declined. There was not nearly 5 million people anymore, and it was coming to an end for the decade. So there started to be a rapid decline, starting in kind of exactly halfway through the decade, and in 1928 there was a few 100,000 people that left the KKK already, so it was declining almost as fast as it grew a few years prior. So there was a couple reasons that they lost. One was because, as I just talked about, they were getting pushed out by organizations and groups that protested against them. And another reason that was because there were a lot of immigration laws that were restricting immigration during the I think in 1919, 1924, and 1929 there were laws passed that restricted immigration, so a lot of the KKK members weren't as concerned with that part of it, and that was an originally huge part of the KKK in the 1920s specifically. So once there were more restriction laws that kind of gave them one less thing to care about. So that's kind of why they lost. So my view on the KKK is negative. I am extremely opposed to everything they believed in and the things that they did, the violence. I am extremely opposed to everything they believed in and the things that they did, the violence, and everything about it. So I think that concludes the KKK in the 1920s and a little information about it. Thank you.